Welcome to What Drives You with your host, Mike Gourdet. Human solution consultant from Seattle, Washington. It is now time to sit back, buckle up for the show that drives the asking question of what drives you. And now your host, Mike Gourdet.
And welcome to today's show of What Drives You, the show about why we do the things we do. We are at our 10th episode, and it had to happen at some point. The interview scheduled for today couldn't make it, so we've got to do something different. So today we are going to do something a little different. We're going to talk about our normal topic of the day. We will have our question of the day, and we will have the consultant's corner where I talk a little bit about the process of some of the issues that I help people deal with. So stick around. We'll be right back when we're going to talk about some cognitive biases. And welcome back. Today, we're going to talk about cognitive biases. Now, this is something that I was going to talk about last week, but we sort of get a little off track because of the heavy information that we talked about last week. But wanted to cover this as part of the process that we've been going through, and this is cognitive biases. These are basically distorted thinking patterns. That's really what they are. We all have them. And, you know, we go through our day thinking that we're very rational people and that we don't have a lot of biases, but that's not true. I mean, if you don't like broccoli, that's actually a bias, right? You would prefer not to eat broccoli. But that's not what I'm quite talking about here. I'm talking about the way we process information and run shortcuts in the brain, which I've talked about in previous episodes with heuristic thinking. And this is also something that works from our belief systems as well. The interesting thing about cognitive bias is that there's very many of them, and we all have them and we all experience them, and yet we don't really think about them. Because again, it's part of our heuristic thinking models that keep us from spending a lot of time and effort working through a problem. So this would be the thin slicing I talked about in the episode where I talked about blink or thinking fast and slow, where we get the information that we need and we get it in a very quick amount of time, and then we make a judgment on that. Okay, so these are ways of thinking that can create problems. And I've talked about some of these in previous episodes, but I'm going to go ahead and go over some of these again. So the major one that I've talked about and I talk about quite frequently is confirmation bias. Now, this is a cognitive bias or distorted thinking pattern that looks for evidence that supports our belief systems and discards evidence that contradicts it. So if I have a belief that I'm not a good enough person, I'm going to find that evidence in my relationships or in my daily activities to support that. And that can be a self-generated thought, like I woke up and I kicked the coffee table and I'm hurting, and I say, well, that was stupid. You're stupid. And my brain would go, well, there's evidence right there. There's evidence that I'm not good or that I'm not good enough. And it will put that in the file of that belief. I'm not good enough. Or if somebody tells me you're mean, or I'm just don't like you, which most people won't do, you're going to take that evidence and you're going to put that in the file. But if somebody says, hey, you know, I really like you, you're a pretty cool guy, if that belief that you're not good enough is strong enough, you're going to discount that information. You don't know me. If you knew me, if you really knew me, you wouldn't say these things about me. And I bet you some of you are doing that right now. That's what we call confirmation bias. Another one that I've talked about on the show is illusory superiority. And that is based on the idea that our skill sets we overinflate our skill sets and underinflate other people's skill sets. And the example that I've used in the past was driving. We all tend to think that we're pretty good drivers. At least we're better drivers than those idiots out there. Because if those idiots knew how to drive, then I wouldn't have to get upset at them. And that's one of the interesting things about this one, because it goes hand in hand with what's called the actor-observer bias. And the actor-observer bias is a bias that says that if I do something, let's say I gave a presentation and it flopped. Because I'm the actor in this situation, I'm going to tell myself and others that there was something wrong with the audio equipment. There was something wrong with traffic when I got there. It's the weather. Basically, I'm blame shifting. And if you remember what we talked about blame shifting, is that that causes me pain. I don't want to take responsibility of that. So I'm going to externalize that. I'm going to take that and I'm going to throw it out in my world. I'm going to find other reasons for it. And consequently, if I'm observing somebody who's giving a bad presentation, I'm not going to blame it on the external events. I'm going to blame it on the person. I'm going to say, well, that person really has no idea what they're doing. And I think we talked a little bit about that when we talked about the gender party snafu down in California. The flip side of that is if I do something good, I'm going to attribute that to myself. If I gave a great presentation, it's all me, baby. If you give a great presentation, not necessarily. So that's actor-observer bias, and that goes hand in hand with the illusory superiority bias. These actually sort of work in tandem to each other quite a bit. And again, these are ways of thinking that are also kind of survival oriented, right? If you can see what I'm talking about, everything I've said so far, you can see that survival component in it, because here I am talking about if I was giving a presentation and it was bad and I externalized that to either the audience or the equipment or the weather or whatever, I'm taking that pain away from me and I'm putting it somewhere where I can deal with it. Because if I can blame it on what's external to my world, that's something I don't have control over. That's something that doesn't work in my favor, but it's okay because it's not my fault. It's not my fault. In the immortal words of Han Solo, it's not my fault. And consequently, if I give a great presentation, I don't have to look outside of myself. I can just say, well, I did a really great thing. Same thing with the confirmation bias. The confirmation bias, even though it may seem weird, if I have a belief that I'm not a good person, and my brain is going to find that evidence because it's looking for reasons to maintain that belief, because that belief is what keeps us alive. Again, all this stuff can be very complex very quickly. But if I have that belief system, that's actually a belief system that helps me survive. And as long as I'm surviving, my brain is happy. That's why my brain is okay with certain things. Like if I'm depressed, if you're depressed, you would think your brain would not want to be there. But in actuality, your brain is happy. And I'll get to that at another point. Another bias that we have is the hindsight bias. And that's pretty evident on top of it. If you take a look at just the wording there, hindsight bias is that given an event, when we look back at it, we often will make the determination that we believed it was something that was going to happen. For instance, in the recent election, when everything is finalized and done, a lot of people are going to go, well, I knew that was going to happen. And they're going to inflate that sense of themselves. We do it all the time. This is one of the reasons why we want to assign blame after something happens, because our hindsight says that should never have happened. Well, I knew this was going to happen. Now we have to find out why it happened, and we have to find out who created the situation that made it happen. You see this 9/11 as a primary example. Who did this? Why did this happen? And we need to find them. We need to find and root it out. Not to say that that was not, a bad thing to do. I'm just saying that that's one of the driving forces behind that. So that's hindsight. Anchoring bias. Anchoring bias is a bias that's based on when we get information, the information that we receive first tends to hold more weight. So we start looking at that weight, or that information weighted on that first piece of information. This can happen in a way. Okay, so one of the ways that this can happen is if you go to the doctor's office and the doctor comes in and looks at your chart and automatically starts creating a diagnosis in his or her head before they get all the information. And then they stick to that. For people who have undiagnosed problems, I think this was probably a very large, back when fibromyalgia was first coming out, the doctors believed this was a psychosomatic illness, and they would say that this is all in your head. You're not actually feeling any pain. Because of that, there was not enough information, and there was confirmation bias going on, plus the anchoring bias. There was no physical symptoms other than complaints of pain. They couldn't detect it on anything. Therefore, it must be in your head. Another one that's related to this would be investigator bias. Investigator bias is when the person who is coming up with let's say a criminal investigator, they're looking for evidence based on a robbery, and they ID a person that they think probably did the robbery because of some of the evidence or the circumstances around it. And what they do then is they anchor on this person, and they decide that person is the guilty party. Therefore, all of the evidence shows them that this person did this. Instead of collecting all the evidence and making a more objective conclusion based on the evidence, they instead finger a perpetrator and then apply the evidence to the perpetrator, up to the point where they can get that perpetrator to actually confess to that crime. We also see this in the science field too, and this is one of the biggest problems with the scientific method and people, right? This is why peer review is so important in the science realm, because a scientist that is going out to do an experiment can get to where they believe their hypothesis is real, and instead of testing the evidence against it, they take the evidence in support of their hypothesis. And again, there's more confirmation bias. See how these go hand in hand, because they will actually discard evidence that doesn't support the hypothesis. So they've already made up their mind what the answer is, and then they start using the data to support themselves. So it's very important in the scientific community to reduce as much of that bias as they possibly can. And that one of the ways they do that is through peer review process, where the experiment has to be duplicatable and replicatable, whatever, under the same conditions. The halo effect. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of the halo effect, but the halo effect is a bias that we attribute to what's nearby. One of the ways that it was taught to me early in my college career was when you get paid. When you get paid, you have a very good sense of yourself, and your problems aren't as bad as they are, and people tend to spend more money the day they get paid, because they have what's called the halo effect. In other terms, in other realms, the halo effect is attributed to physical attractiveness in other people, where we attribute traits that are otherwise good to people who are physically attractive. So if I say, well, that woman is beautiful, then she must also be nice. She must also be pleasant. She must also be this, this, and this. If that man is handsome, then these are the attributes that he's probably smart. And we've seen this in when television first hit the scene with presidential candidates, how we attributed things to their height. If they were tall, then we respect them more, and they got more votes. This also explains advertisements that use different forms of extraneous things. This is how sex sells, right? You have a rock that you're trying to sell. If you put a woman in a bathing suit, you're going to sell more rocks, because there's a halo effect going on. And we're also gauging your primal instincts there too. We're doing it for both male and female as well. So don't think I'm just being a guy here. But we do this all the time. We attribute different things to what's around what we're looking at. This is one of my favorites. The optimism bias. I'm not against optimism. I'm against false optimism. And one of the problems that we have with the optimism bias is that we tend to overestimate the likelihood that good things are going to happen to us, and we underestimate the negative side effects that can occur from this. Okay, this is one. Again, don't get all upset because I'm bashing a little bit on the positive mindset or the optimistic mindset, half full people. I'm not. I'm telling you that this is actually a distorted thinking pattern in certain circumstances. It doesn't mean that it's bad. It just means that people who are optimistic tend to overestimate the good things that can happen to them, and they underestimate that negative things can occur because of their activities. And like I said, there's a whole slew of these, and one of the most interesting ones, if I may say, is there's a bias, and that is the bias that we have that says that we don't have biases. So we actually have a bias about biases. And these are just some examples of the way our brain interacts with our external environment and our internal self through its daily life. And there are so many problems that can be caused by this. We talk about unconscious bias in certain places, which is responsible for some of our racist attitudes, some of our gender stereotyping, and all this other stuff. But all these biases are at play all the time, and they are molding the way we think and act and react and move through our environments. How's that for some stuff? I know that sometimes I get on these roles and it seems like I'm getting very pessimistic, but let's be optimistic about this. The point is that we have these are a part of the functions of our brain. We need to be aware of them. The more that we are aware of these things, the more that we can see them in our consciousness. The more that we can address things like, if I feel like I am not a good person, and I know that my brain is going to find that evidence, that's where my consciousness has power, because I can consciously go, well, that's false. Here's some evidence that shows I am a good person, or here's some evidence that shows that I am a good driver. You saw that one. Here's some evidence of this. Okay. So being aware of these things are one of the first ways, one of the ways that we can influence the way we think. It can also influence it can also influence our beliefs and our internal processes. We can even use this format to change some of our deepest fears, which I've talked about in the past, is difference equals danger. We can change that. And we do. That's how we learn to live with each other. That's how we overcome things like racism or gender biases, is by using our conscious mind to influence those unconscious beliefs and system responses. So, okay, so that's it for that. Like I said, there's tons and tons of these. I encourage you to look them up and check them out for yourself. Some of them are very fascinating. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to do the consulting corner, where I'm going to talk a little bit about stagnation. So we'll be right back. All right. And thanks for sticking around. One of the things that I do is I work with people who are stuck. They're stagnating. They feel trapped. And there's a lot of components to this type of thing. And more than likely you've gone through it, because we all go through periods of time where we're stagnating. We don't feel like we're making any headway. We don't feel like we're doing anything productive or effective, and it can lead to depression. In fact, depression is a component of it. Another component is circling thought patterns, externalizing, lack of energy, which is a function of depression as well, and lack of focus. How do we deal with this? Well, one way that we can deal with this is let's take the circling thoughts, for instance. So circular thought patterns are where we just grind out the same thought over and over and over again. Over and over and over again. And why do we do that? Well, if you think about it in terms of that survival response and everything that I've been talking about, is when you do that, your brain actually in real time believes that it's doing something. And because it's doing something, it interprets that as productivity and it rewards that behavior. So when we get into those circular, I'm doing this. When we get into those circular thought patterns, our brain is actually rewarding that behavior. So it is keeping that pattern alive because it feels like we're doing something. It's like sitting in a rocking chair. You're not really getting anywhere, but you're doing something, and your brain rewards that, and it normalizes it. That's the next thing your brain does. It makes it seem normal that you're doing that, and when it does that, this is what's called creating that comfort zone. So people with a lot of anxiety, this is one of the ways they get themselves into these is by the brain rewarding that behavior of anxiety. So what can we do? Well, I just read, I think it was in Psychology Today, not too long ago, the really interesting thing is to schedule time for circular thinking. And this seems kind of counterintuitive, but it really makes a lot of sense. So you say it's at 6 p.m., I'm going to allow my brain to cycle over whatever it is that I usually am having my circular thoughts about. I'm going to do that for half an hour, and I schedule it. And how is this important? Well, again, we bring in the conscious mind, which is our tool. Our best tool for anything is our conscious brain. So we're going to take that conscious brain, and anytime we find ourselves circling our thoughts outside of that time frame, we can go, nope, I schedule it. I need to go and do something. So I go distract myself, or I tell myself it's not going to happen. And I can actually create my brain a pathway that says, okay, we're going to do this later. And then when 6 o'clock rolls around, I can sit down and I can let this stuff roll. And I can let it roll until it just becomes the next function here is desensitized. So I just let it roll until it becomes desensitized. So I'm giving my brain a little bit of a directive here. And during that little time frame, I'm allowing it to do what it does. And at some point, it might even extinguish itself. So that's a really cool idea. Think about it, try it, and let me know. I would be really interested to hear your experiences with that. And that's one way that we can take care of being or unsticking ourselves, if you can follow that. So unsticking yourself. And that's what I wanted to talk about today. We're going to be right back, and then we're going to jump into our question of the day, which is, why do we procrastinate? I'm sure everybody's waiting to hear what that answer is, but I bet you if you have been listening, you can already know what it is. So hang on, we'll be back. Okay, and we're back. And today's question of the day is, why do we procrastinate? And this particular question comes from Dean. Thanks, Dean. Why do we procrastinate? Well, we're kind of wired to do it. Can you guess? Can you guess why we procrastinate? I'll give you just a sec, because I talk about it all the time. And this is where we can see where some of our behaviors are very simple. We procrastinate because the immediacy of something that we need to do does not create the pain that it needs to create for us to do it. And given that choice between the pleasure of me not doing something right now and the pain of jumping into something is overbalanced to the pleasure part of my brain. And so I'm going to sit around in my comfort zone. Now, let's say we have a test deadline or some kind of deadline that we need to do. As we approach that time frame or that timeline termination, we start building more pain up in our brain. And at some point, that pain is big enough to switch over, and we create the activation energy to go and do that thing. So for all of you folks out there who like to believe that you work well under pressure, that's kind of what you're doing, is actually you're procrastinating until the pain of the impending deadline is so bad that you can't stand it anymore. And so you just get to it. Now, I'm not going to put a whole lot of judgment on this because I have done this as well, especially when I was in college. I would I would sometimes wait until the night before I started a paper. What are the probable outcomes? Well, if you probably already know that if you do this, you can create this pressure to do the task, but the task is being rushed because you haven't put enough effort into the organizing or planning around the task. So in essence, that need to wait until the pain is big enough in your brain for you to do it creates a rush situation where you're relying more on that pressure than actually taking the time to figure out the problem. And what can we do to combat this? Well, very simple. We consciously make a decision that we're not going to do it, and we feed that decision every time it needs to happen. So if I'm in school, this is one of the easiest ways of doing this. If I'm in school and I get an assignment, my immediate response is to want to put it off. So what do you think the immediate response consciously should be? Is to get started on it. Do something right now. It doesn't mean you have to complete the assignment. It doesn't mean that you have to rush it to get it done. You just have to take action right now. Because by taking action right now, you're feeding your brain a whole new directive, and you're rewarding yourself for that. And over time, if you continue to do this, the neural pathways are going to be stronger and stronger so that you are more likely to not procrastinate. Now, that subsystem is still going to be there, the procrastination, because that's been rewarded for, I can almost say genetically, because we're all kind of wired to do this. But that's been rewarded and rewarded and rewarded. So when you let down your guard, that's when that will take over again. And this is how a lot of our brain does it. You know, it's okay while you're consciously making the effort, while you're prioritizing the right way to do something, or, you know, you're trying to quit smoking, or we talk about willpower and quitting addiction and how that doesn't work. That's how that happens, is that we are using our willpower to generate the energy to not do what we want to do, which is put that cigarette in our mouth. And at some point, we're going to be too tired to fight it. And when we get to that point, that old behavior is going to click in, and we're going to put it in there. We may even do it without even thinking about it. And as soon as I put that cigarette in my mouth, I'm right back. I'm right back to where I was. And it becomes that much more difficult to apply the willpower again to go back and quit. That's why it's so hard to give up things cold turkey, because our brains just don't like that. So That is the answer to that question, Dean. Thanks a lot. I hope you enjoyed today's show, even though we didn't have our regularly scheduled interview. I appreciate you hanging by. And if you have questions about anything we've talked about or want some clarification or anything, give me a holler at mike@whatdrivesyou.net. That's mike@whatdrivesyou.net. You guys have a pleasant week. Thank you for listening. Take care.